The board minutes. This video could be an hour long, 2 hours long. Yeah, if you're in this field long enough, you learn a lot about board minutes. But we're going to keep this under 15 minutes. So let's go on. The official record of action taken at the board meeting. I remember being a young associate in a law firm working on a pending merger and being whisked into a bank vault to read a bunch of binders that contained the bank's minutes, for like 100 years. It was like reading Greek. And I could understand what was on the page. I just didn't know what to do with it. And in most cases, the minutes aren't too detailed, so there really isn't much you can do with them. Why are the minutes so bare boned? And if they're not, why not? Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of yous. Although boards are required to keep minutes under state law, the state in which their company is incorporated, they have the latitude to take the minutes in any way they wish. So as a result, there's no uniform approach to drafting them, and practices really do vary. So just as important as deciding a board's drafting style is deciding how minutes are organized. They're almost always in chronological order, but what other things are you doing to aid searches? Searches are required all the time for when independent auditors come in, lawyers representing a company seeking to buy your company, regulators seeking to confirm that the board didn't take the actions that were required. So here are 13 things to consider about board minutes. 1, long form or short form style. 2, prepare draft before meeting. 3, use draft for prep sessions. 4, use consistent language. 5, track attendance. 6, track comings and goings. 7, handle dissents. 8, handle formal resolutions. 9, handle executive sessions. 10, facilitate near-term follow-ups. 11, track long-term follow-ups. 12, circulate for reviews. And 13, circulate for final approval. 1, long form or short form style. So this is this is the debate in the minutes area. So many boards keep minutes that are truly bare bone. Short form style, just sufficient detail to cover the regulatory requirements. Some boards go to the other extreme with minutes noting which director asked which question. Some boards fall squarely in the middle. So this is, like I said, part of the long simmering debate about whether the minutes should be short or long form. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each approach. Short form minutes obviously can be drafted more quickly, are easier to read, so you can quickly determine what action was taken and are less likely to be ambiguous. But they don't really reveal why particular decisions were made. They don't really convey the extent of a board's diligence about a matter. So long form minutes solve those deficiencies. You can see the board's diligence, understand the board's deliberations, their intentions. So long form may be more beneficial in litigation unless those minutes actually reveal a lack of diligence, have some inconsistencies, or more likely are open to misinterpretation. So falling in the middle, the hybrid approach is where some boards land, providing greater detail on particularly sensitive or significant matters, and only the basics if the discussion is merely routine. 2, prepare a draft before the meeting. So it is actually common to prepare a draft of the minutes well before the meeting takes place. It's crazy as that sounds. So because you need it. If you go into the meeting without a draft, it's really hard to keep up and stay tuned to the meeting. Stay tuned into what's happening while you're trying to draft everything that you need to draft. So you're going to use the meeting agenda and the board materials to help craft this draft set of minutes, making it very action-oriented, not like a transcript. Include what actions are being sought and the rationale for them. And before the meeting, circulate those draft minutes for review within the management team, the key board members like the board chair and lead director, and perhaps a committee chair if that committee figures prominently at this meeting. And then that draft set of minutes actually sometimes goes to the full board as part of the board materials. And of course, at the meeting, you're going to modify the draft to match what really transpires. 3, use a draft for the prep session. So this draft set of minutes is prepared before there's a prep session for the board meeting. That enables you to test it against what the chair has planned, the board chair has planned. You can also see if it matches what's expected to happen in any executive session planned at the meeting. And that's important so that you can provide action item notes to whomever is tasked with taking minutes during the executive session if you're asked to leave the room. 4, use consistent language. So it seems obvious, but you want consistency in your language from meeting to meeting and from year to year, and so that when the board is undertaking similar actions, you can just look back and say, oh, okay, we're doing that again, we're doing this again. And you want to be consistent here. And that goes double if you need to include buzzwords that match what certain regulatory requirements require that you do. Including these buzzwords enables those reviewing the minutes to more quickly determine whether you're up to speed in meeting your regulatory requirement. 5, track attendance. So item 407 of Regulation SK requires that companies report in their proxy any directors who attended less than 75% of the board meetings, and I have a separate vid guide about that disclosure requirement. But the purpose of that here is that you need to track attendance to fulfill this disclosure obligation. So when you're drawing up the draft minutes, you're going to note who you already know is not able to attend the meeting, and take a note of what the reason was, whether it was a prior commitment or whatever, because you might need to explain the reason in the proxy. That's going to help you explain away mitigating circumstances. Directors don't like to be identified in the proxy for having missed too many meetings. That's obvious. So later on, you might have directors who argue that they were at a meeting that they weren't. And if you can identify the reason why they missed the meeting, that might help jog their memory. So that's another reason why you want to put down the reason. Of course, if you have a last minute cancellation by a director and they don't attend, you're going to add that to the minutes as well. Also consider establishing in other tracking mechanisms rather than rely solely on the minutes for this purpose. That will make it easier to determine each director's attendance record when it comes time to draft that proxy. While the minutes serve as the official record, you don't want to rely solely on that for purposes of the proxy disclosure. 6, tracking comings and goings. So this is a challenging one. For certain comings and goings, presenters, for example, you'll know when that's going to happen and include those in the draft minutes because you're going to already have that kind of mapped out. Make sure you have walked through those logistics well before the meeting, having the presenters waiting in the wings. And then you may need to note other interim arrivals and departures. Directors may be excused from deliberating on a matter because they have a conflict of interest, or someone just had to leave the meeting early for whatever reason, or maybe they have to take a phone call. Of course, you don't need to note brief comings and goings, bathroom breaks, someone left for a minute to check for an urgent voice message, unless they missed a vote, then you have to note that. But what do you do if a director leaves and is gone a half hour? Practice is divided here, but to me that is a significant length of time. It should be noted in the final minutes. I don't think you need to be precise. Don't use a timestamp. I would just put so-and-so left the meeting and then so-and-so rejoined later on, something like that in the minutes. The reason is this: if there are questions about the minutes later on, if someone asks a director who left about their recollection of it, it's helpful for them and it protects them if there's a record somewhere that they can point to and say they were not there for the entire meeting. 7, handling dissents. So unless required by state law or the company's governance documents, dissents are not required to be noted in the minutes when a board approves an item. However, dissents are noted if that is what is requested by the dissenting director, or based on your determination that the dissent should be noted to protect the interests of the dissenting director because the matter is controversial. 8, handle formal resolutions. So a board resolution is a formal documentation that a certain board action was taken. These are actually the most important part of the minutes, so they should be drafted with care, very precisely, leaving no room for ambiguity or misunderstanding. Many board actions don't require formal board resolutions. The minutes can just briefly describe that the board took a certain action. However, some actions require these formal resolutions, and these are typically pretty long and detailed. And then they're included typically in the board material so the directors can see exactly what will be presented for a vote at the actual board meeting. So you're going to have a number of people reviewing a draft board resolution before it goes in the board materials, including in-house and maybe even outside counsel. Resolutions often specifically reference other documents that further explain them. They're cross-referencing something, and then those documents and any other supporting papers are kept as a part of the record of the meeting. And sometimes kept in a separate binder or separate from the board minutes. You have the board resolution and it's part of the board minutes, but then you might have a binder just of the board resolutions you've passed over time, and you have them chronologically in there. Board resolutions are either included in the body of the minutes or attached to the minutes as an exhibit and identified and incorporated by reference within the body of the minutes. So you'll need a library of the draft board resolutions that you'll be drawing upon regularly, the things that come up frequently over the years, resolutions that relate to banking, financing, execution authority, that signature authority policy stuff, equity plan approval, the designation of Section 16 officers, the kind of things that definitely will bubble up from time to time. You also need a library of the resolutions that have been approved by the board over the years, like I mentioned earlier. So you want to organize your library in a way so that you can quickly find a particular resolution, a database, so you can sort it out in any number of ways by corporate entity, board or committee type, whether it's a unanimous written consent or not, chronological year and date. Another thing that corporate secretaries often do is keep organized by writing up a brief summary of the minutes for a meeting soon after that meetings have been approved. Then these summaries are slotted in there and included at the front of each year's minute book. So this essentially creates a table of contents of the big things that happen during board meetings over the course of the year. 9, handle executive sessions. So as noted in my vid guide on executive sessions, minute taking can be different for these sessions compared to a regular board meeting, particularly if a different person is the one who's actually taking the minutes. That person will need to be coached on what to do. Typically, only bare bone minutes are kept for these sessions, just documenting that an executive session was held on a certain date and time at a certain location, the participants, and the session duration. You might include a general description of the topics discussed for purposes of illustrating that the board fulfilled the fiduciary duty or refreshing recollections. But as noted in that vid guide I mentioned on executive sessions, if specific actions are taken that need to be known by management, for example, the number of restricted stock units that were granted to executive officers, the minutes should reflect that very specifically. 10, facilitate near-term follow-ups. So during the board meeting, a number of things will be promised, or directors may request certain things to happen and be reported back. For example, the preparation of a study. It's your job to keep a list of all these promises and then ensure that there is a follow-up by those tasks. Some people that are tasked may not have even been in the room. They may not even work for the company. So this could involve a bit of work sometimes to get the ball rolling and then nag people to deliver. I've discussed this more in my board meetings vid guide. 11, track long-term follow-ups. So also take notes for the longer-term items that you should be dealing with. For example, people will sometimes make a comment to the effect of, the next time we talk about X, I'd really love it if you could provide us information about Y. And so this is not an item for immediate action. This is not related to what I just said earlier. It might even be a year or two away, but you get points if you remember and deliver. 12, circulate for review. So the process of seeking final review of the minutes should begin soon after the board meeting ends while memories are still fresh. Shoot for that circulation to happen within a week of each meeting, but that sometimes does not happen. If the meeting includes presentations, some corporate secretaries will run the draft minutes by those people too, that excerpt of the portion that relates to the presentation. Similarly, circulate excerpts outside parties like the auditors if they will be there for a portion of the meeting. Often there are layers of review. One manager reviews this before it goes to a different manager or to a committee chair. So you really need to be organized so that those reviewing the minutes get back to you timely. You're pushing people to meet specific deadlines that you're the one that's setting those deadlines. So you're using a matrix, a minutes tracker to know where all the moving parts stand. These things have been brought in, these things are here, and those things are there. This is important to do. 13, circulate for final approval. So after you get all those comments after review, you prepare your final set of minutes, and then those are sent to the board for the formal approval at the next meeting as part of the board materials. You're sending the final minutes for approval. And that's going to be uploaded to your board portal. Then at the next regularly scheduled meeting, the board gives the final blessing, the final approval, and this means that there will be a month or two lag between when a board meeting ends and when the final minutes for that meeting are actually approved. Unless there's a big fuss, final minutes are not recirculated to the directors if changes are actually made when they're reviewing the final minutes. You would only do this in the rare instance where there was a substantial disagreement about what actually transpired at that prior meeting. Once approved by the board, the final minutes, along with any supporting materials, are officially placed in the minute books after being signed by the corporate secretary or whoever served as a secretary of that particular meeting if the corporate secretary didn't happen to attend.